This is the second in a series of videos about discipleship and discipleship training. You've come to the right place if you want to learn more about how to be a disciple yourself, or if you want to learn more about how to make disciples. I'm Rocky Nystrom, and today we're going to be looking at some of the potential avenues for addressing the needs that surfaced in our first video. If you missed the first video, there's a link to it at the bottom of this page. You've made a good decision to join us today. My goal is to give you some things to think about, and to give you some specific takeaways regarding how to do discipleship training. Our recommendations are based on the successes of leading discipleship practitioners, as well as our own experiences spanning 30 years in this ministry. Today we want to spend some time thinking about how to best tackle the issues surrounding the current state of discipleship. Maybe that sounds like a goal that's a bit too lofty for the limited time we have together. And maybe it is. Perhaps a better way to approach it is for us to think about what you and I can do to address these problems within the realm of our own sphere of influence. What could we be doing at a grassroots level to turn things around? Now I want to pause here for just a minute and issue a word of caution. Before we start talking about solutions and recommended approaches, we need to make it very clear that there are many ways to go about this. And the word of caution is this: there's a risk that we could take too firm a stand on some things. There are many ways to approach discipleship training, and there are many different methods and tactics being used out there with good results. So we don't want to take a hard line or in any way suggest that our approach is the only effective one. That's not what we see in Scripture. God in His wisdom didn't lay out a single method for accomplishing His work. He provided a broad framework along with many great examples and gave us the freedom to do discipleship training in whatever way seems best in our circumstances. However, remember I said I was going to give you some specific takeaways that will help you in this endeavor? I want to make good on that promise, starting with some high-level recommendations and moving to some practical advice that will potentially make a huge difference in the results that you're able to produce. You couldn't go wrong if you wanted to make disciples and all you did was read the Bible with someone, and that both of you were determined to follow what it has to say and put it into practice in your life. In keeping with that notion, our high-level recommendation is that you think about discipleship as a life-on-life, relationship-based focused on the things of God and what's pleasing to Him. Many years ago, one of my mentors said, "Discipleship making is nothing more than a spiritual friendship." I found that notion really useful, and it helped me to understand that I could disciple people simply by making friends and sharing my life with them, and encourage them in their walk with the Lord. It reminds me of a passage in Deuteronomy chapter 6, where we're instructed to make meditating on the commands of God part of our daily routine. We're told to teach them diligently to our children as we go about the course of our lives. It seems to be describing a very natural process whereby people learn from us through what we teach them, but also by spending time with us and observing how we live. So that's the first principle. The most effective way to approach disciple making is to think in terms of life-on-life, relationship-based mentoring. You could even go so far as to say that disciples are made in relationships and not in programs. In terms of some practical advice, it's helpful to make note of some common disciple-making practices and to avoid the detrimental impacts of those approaches. In this vein, we want to spend some time talking and thinking about a common approach, which is to launch a discipleship program. Once again, we turn to our friend Greg Ogden and his advice from an article called "Making Disciples Jesus Way, a Few at a Time." You can download this article at the link provided below this video. He talks about a number of unhelpful aspects of discipleship programs that we need to consider and avoid. In the first instance, Greg notes that discipling relationships are marked by intimacy, where programs tend to be focused on information. Discipleship programs sometimes operate on the assumption that filling someone's head with knowledge will lead to transformation. You could also argue that this approach is a bit lazy in the sense that it's easier to impart knowledge than it is to become intimately involved with someone's life. It's also useful to think about discipling relationships ideally involving the mutual responsibility of everyone involved. In contrast, programs tend to have one or a few who do on the benefit of the many. In my own experience with small groups, or growth groups as they're sometimes called, they inevitably involve a leader who comes prepared to deliver a message or facilitate a discussion around a specific topic. When one individual does the hard work of preparing, it sets up a dynamic where the rest come along as passive participants. The most effective discipling relationships allow for customization to the unique needs and growth processes of individuals. Programs, on the other hand, tend to emphasize synchronization and regimentation. They make the naive assumption that everyone in the program has the same needs at the same time. Finally, discipling relationships ideally focus accountability around life change, whereas programs focus accountability around content. Perhaps you've had the experience of going along to a Bible study or a program designed to facilitate your spiritual growth. You go through the motions and do the homework because you know you'll be found out if you don't know the material. No doubt the material is impacting your life in some way, but not nearly as much as it would if you were in a relationship where life change was the focus. Questions need to be asked like, how is this content shaping your life? What plans can we make together to make these principles into a way of thinking and a habit in our lives? In summary, discipleship programs, though often well-meaning, can have some detrimental effects. It's not a question of terminology or semantics. We're not trying to get folks hung up on the word program. In fact, you may hear us use that word from time to time. The point is that discipleship programs can operate a bit like a vaccine. They give you just enough of something to keep you from getting the real thing. I have Billy Graham to thank for that analogy. He said it, referring to Christianity, some people get just enough of it to keep them from getting the real thing. Other practical advice we can offer comes from our own experience providing biblical counseling and discipleship over many years. We've captured this advice in a document called 3 Vital Keys to Life-Transforming Discipleship. The first of these vital keys is to help disciples produce good fruit. In John 15, verse 6, Jesus said, "My Father is glorified in this, that you bear much good fruit, and so prove to be my disciples." We need to make sure as disciple makers that we aren't attempting to change bad behavior into good behavior. Christians are often frustrated by their bad behavior, or bad fruit, if you will, and either try to hide it or remove it just to see it grow back again. The answer is to deal with the root cause. Behavior is the visible expression of someone's belief or root system. The fruit represents good or bad actions, emotions, attitudes, or relationships. The root represents what a person believes about God, themselves, and others. As this diagram illustrates, we either believe truth or lies. When we believe truth, we produce good fruit, and when we believe lies, we produce bad fruit. There are a number of familiar biblical passages that confirm this dynamic. The second vital key is to teach truth for every area of life. Many Christians have a compartmentalized view of life. For example, they might put their relationship with God in one box and their relationship with others in another box. This wrong view of life tends to limit God's activity to only one or two areas of life. The result is that making decisions without considering what God has to say, which often leads to failure. When someone has a compartmentalized view of life, they don't realize that problems in one area of life can affect other areas. For example, a man who doesn't recognize or follow God's plan in the financial area of life might get his family deep into debt. The debt puts a strain on his marriage, the marital area of life. He experiences stress and worry, the psychological area of life, and headaches, the physical area of life. The answer is to teach how God's truth applies to every area of life. God wants to be Lord over every area of life, as well as help us grow in each one. Think for a minute about what it says about Jesus in Luke 2:52. And Jesus grew in wisdom, in the psychological area of life. He also grew in stature, in the physical area of life, and in favor with God, the spiritual area of life, and in favor with men, the social area of life. People often seek help when they're struggling in one area of life, like their marriage. but they don't always see the point in addressing their relationship with God or their thinking in other areas at the same time. The third vital key is to teach people to hear, apply, and share God's truth. Following the cycle of discipleship is critical to effective discipleship. The hearing phase happens when people read the Bible, listen to a sermon, or read or consume other types of Christian content. However, if they stop there, not much change is likely to take place. Studies show we only remember about 10% of the things that are just merely heard. The applying phase is what happens when people apply biblical truths to their everyday life by obeying what God shows them to do when they pray and read the Bible. The sharing phase happens when people talk about and share what they're learning. We need to encourage those we disciple to share what they're learning with others. When people hear, apply, and share what they've been learning, they tend to have a much higher retention rate. As a final thought on disciple-making effectiveness, I want to encourage you to consider the importance of your local church. God has given us the church and provided for us through the gifts and abilities of those involved. In spite of this, we can sometimes be fault-finding and overly critical about what happens or doesn't happen in our local church. In your zeal, you might go off on your own and launch into discipleship initiatives without involving your church leadership. That would be a mistake, an example of zeal without knowledge. I can say confidently that the effectiveness of your disciple-making efforts will always be enhanced when they're applied in the context of and under the authority of your local church. That's all we have time for today. It was my aim to give you some practical advice about how to get the most out of your discipleship-making efforts. I hope I've achieved that goal today. In our next video, we'll spend some time talking specifically about VCLi's unique approach to discipleship training. We'll talk about the content we have to offer and explain how you can use that content in your own discipleship endeavors. By the end of the next video, you'll have a very clear idea about how our approach addresses the many problem areas we've identified and how you can get off on the right foot from the beginning. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.